Okay, so I will start, and then Matthew has his part, and then hopefully we have a nice conversation. Thanks for invitation. I'm very grateful to be here, and I will be talking about project as ongoing project. This is something that I'm working on, and in fact, because of COVID-19, I'm stuck in Sheffield, but I should be in Brazil at that moment for last month, in fact. Um, as you see, there's a group of people involved in that, and I believe that at least one person from the team is in the audience at that moment. So hopefully, if I'm going to say something incorrect, I will be corrected later on. Okay, so my main argument, really, as you see from the title, is that religion and faith are not necessarily the same things. And I would like to talk about this in a context of architecture. Okay. So just very quickly to introduce the topic, I don't know how much you know about Brazil, but there was a potential perception of Brazil as Catholic country with predominant Catholic population, but it's not true. It was true, let's say, till late 60s, but at that moment, as you see, there was a massive changes and massive growth of other strand of Christianity, of Pentecostal churches. It's not one church, there's many different churches that we'll be talking about. And also this religious movement, it has massive influence on contemporary current Brazilian politics. In Brazilian parliament, there's 195 members of Congress that they are member of something that is called Evangelical Bloc or Evangelical Caucus, and 8 members of the Senate. The total number, as you see, is 513 and 81. So it's massive chunk of parliamentarians are member of this Evangelical Bloc. Okay, next. And again, as an introduction, very quick introduction, when we talk about religion and religious spaces, this is very classic, very phenomenological approach to what religious spaces are from Mircea Eliade. In general, the religious spaces are the only one, the real spaces. The spaces that they are profane are just chaotic outside of this kind of an ontological foundation of the world. So the sacred space is a space that give a sense, give a meaning to the world. And then next slide, those let's say postmodern approach to what sacred spaces are. But sacred spaces are not given, like in Eliade case, but are constructed. Yeah? So they are constructed through rituals, through prayers, through activities. Okay, and this is the way how sacred spaces are constructed. Okay, next one. So it's not that there was only one approach, and it's not that, let's say, in the past there was one type of sacred spaces and now it changed. I would rather argue that we live in a pretty pluralistic world, and in the same moment, different people see world differently. So for some, and I'm talking only on believers, or about believers, or people who believe. So for some people, the world is enchanted. So it means that there are sacred spaces out there that we can discover. For other people, these sacred spaces are constructed. But there are also people that the sacred spaces, there are no sacred spaces really. And the only kind of sacred bit of the world is embedded in the believer. Okay, next one. So it's a kind of a ecosystem of religious spaces that I would say that some of the spaces are pretty straightforward. So it's a spaces to practice religion, like temples, for example. There are places and spaces that they are related more to culture and the way how people are living their life as believers. And those are kind of positive and negative spaces. So on the on one hand, you have spaces that they are related to religion in a positive way. On the other hand, there are places that believers are avoiding. And then there's also much more subjective, much more personal sacred spaces related to individual or the experience of individuals in different ways. Okay, next one. So going back to Brazil, as I said, Pentecostalism is not one church. It's a rather relatively loose combination of a lot of different groups. And in Brazilian context, there's a kind of typology of three ways of Pentecostalism. The first was kind of imported, let's say. So this is the main church, is Assembleia de Deus, but there are more. There was the second wave in mid-20th century, and the newest, the last wave, end of 20th century, with the most influential church, Universal, which is also very strongly supportive the current president of Brazil. What is interesting about this, that they have also a relatively different approach to their different theological stance. That, you know, I will probably not talk about this too much, but they have also different recommendation expectation from believers. So as you see, so for example, this second wave, the church of book is love. They are very, very strict concerning individual behaviors. And in an interesting way, the most, let's say, politically right-wing church is relatively liberal concerning individual behavior. Okay, next one. So as I said, there was a massive number of different churches. This is just a random map from Vitoria in state Espírito Santo. And on the map, you see different places, different churches of different denomination. This red dots are two Catholic places. The others are all evangelical. Not all of them are Pentecostal, but most of them are, oh, all of them are evangelical, and most of them are Pentecostal. Okay, next one. And this is important. This is how these churches look like. And because they are so diverse, some of them are member and kind of loose member of bigger churches. So they are kind of branches of bigger churches, but they are also very small, very local churches that they just exist in one particular place, and the relationship to kind of to broader or wider institution and group is a very, very light touch. Okay, so next slide, we have another example, and there's one more. Yeah, so you see there's a really kind of places that they are not really putting too much attention how they look like. They are just places where people can come to pray. Next slide. But then there are also churches like that. This is the Universal Church, the main church from the last wave of Brazilian Pentecostalism or Neo-Pentecostalism. This is a church in Belo Horizonte. What is interesting, when you use Google Map, you can, churches are treated as service buildings. So as you see here, this church has 4.6 stars, so it's pretty good. But you can easily find churches with 2.5 stars, so it's really bad service. You should avoid. Okay, the next one. The next one is the same picture, the same photo of the same church. So you see this is massive difference between the small, very local, kind of community-oriented churches and this, which is massive, is rich. Also, the archbishop of this church is a millionaire. He's a really, really rich man. Okay, the next one. The way how we approach the project, what we have been doing, we have been trying to see if people who believe, they see space in different way that people that they believe differently or don't believe. So we have been using, this very basic Lynchian type of mental mapping, asking people to draw what they world look like. But it was in fact unsuccessful. The most of maps that we got look like this. So I would say that's probably Uber and Google Map influence. So it's just a places and then the line connecting. The next one, yeah, it's just Minia Casa, so my house, and Iglesia, church, and that's it. What is here. The next one, this is the most advanced, the most developed. But even here, what is interesting here is important that, and it's partly because what the Brazilian cities look like, and the people we interview in occupied territories, so not in centers, and they are not kind of middle class people, they are mostly people from other poorer strata of Brazilian society. But you see that the amount of kind of public spaces on these maps are, on previous maps, there's none. On this one, it's very limited. But in general, I would say that it's a pretty, we failed. Yeah, so it was not really successful way of collecting data. Next one. But doing this research, we found something else, something that I didn't expect, and it was a surprise, which shaped the way how the next stage of the research will be conducted. So we found that people who really believe very strongly and really that faith is organizing their life, they are not necessarily people that they practice religion in the social way as a social phenomenon. And there was a two quotation here that I would like to read. But in almost everybody that we interview, they told us something similar. So one woman says, I'm Christian, I attend Assembleia de Deus, and Assembly of God is very complex, has issue about clothing and about daily habits. Many things I do not agree. I find it irrelevant. I do not follow. I just go there, exercise my faith, and I'm gone. I'm not a member. And the second person is saying very similar. I'm a person of faith. I believe in God. I even go to church, but I don't belong to any church. From time to time, I go to university. And this is important on two levels. First of all, because it means that these massive spaces that they are constructed for believers are not necessary for people who really strongly believe, and it's not really related to faith. And the second issue is that it means that the private spaces, the spaces like bathrooms, bedrooms, or even own cars, they became places of practicing faith. Next slide. So this is just a hypothesis that I have after the first stage, that there was two kind of actualization of Pentecostalism in Brazil. One, faith, which is much more intimate, it's a very personal. And then there's a religion, which is socially performed activities. And these two actualizations are not necessarily related to some extent, but this is probably far-fetched hypothesis. I even would say that in some cases they are opposite. So people who are strongly believers they practice less, and people who are attending churches, they are looking for faith that they don't really have so much. But as I said, this is very far-fetched hypothesis that I'm hoping to test. Next one. So now I would like to put this very quickly in a context of what's going on in Brazil at that moment. So, you know, as I said, I'm not in Brazil, even I would like to be. So next slide. This is what happened relatively recently. The president of Brazil, very right wing, he opposed lockdown, he opposed social distancing. He fired his Ministry of Health. And to some extent, as you see from these quotations, people who support him, the different pastors who support them, they to some extent they are using similar language like right-wing politicians and right-wing kind of members of society in the United States, with this famous slogan that Jesus is my vaccine. So it's not exactly like this, but it's a very, very, very close. Okay, next one. But as I said, the evangelical movement in Brazil is much more diverse. And there was this split between Pentecostal churches that they are relatively new and this kind of more traditional churches like Anglican churches and Presbyterian churches, that they behave differently. So here you have quotation from people that they are supporting social distancing or spatial distancing rather, and they don't have a problem to move into teaching and praying online. Okay, next one. And also to make it very clear that it's not that the division is between this kind of, let's say, traditional evangelical or Protestant churches and the Pentecostal. This is a recommendation from Pentecostal World Fellowship, which very clearly states avoid physical contact and when possible stay home and away from crowds and so on, so on. So it's absolutely supporting the policy implemented by many governments. Next one. Also, as a very, very quick digression, Brazil is one of the countries where the difference between the religious or conflict between the religious faith and the kind of support for vaccination is the lowest. Yeah? So as you see, Saudi Arabia, Finland, and Brazil, there's a very small percentage of people that they have problem. There's a conflict between personal beliefs, religious beliefs, and vaccination. Yeah? So it's not like you know, Italy or even United States. Okay, next. So this is another about this conflict between different groups in religious groups in Brazil. But as I said, it's not so easy, so simple that Pentecostal are supporting Bolsonaro and kind of traditional or you know, other part of Protestants they not. These differences are really cutting through different groups, and they are not so much related to religion, but they are, I would say, purely related to politics. Politics is maybe something else, and this is the last two slides, I believe. The next one. So this is churches that in general support lockdown, support social distancing, and they are community oriented, and they work with community, they live with community. And on the other hand, the next slide, this is Temple of Solomon, built by Universal Church in São Paulo, absolutely massive building that they need crowd. They don't really work for local community. And this church, they oppose lockdown. They want crowd, because without crowd, they can't really function in the way that they want. So this is my part. I'm done for me, and now it's too much.
Thanks, Krzysztof. So I'm going to present a section of my research that I conducted in Turkey, based around the mosque as a political tool that's used by the government. Throughout the course of its tumultuous history, the Turkish Republic has paradoxically rejected and subsequently adopted the mosque as a representation of national unity, an affirmation of the rhetorical terms from which national ideologies are built. The mosque of today is an ideological device used in rebuilding a national identity with reference to the Turkish nation within Islam. On the 1st of November 1922, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, eclipsing more than 6 centuries of Islamic rule in Europe and the Middle East. The ensuing chaos that led to the foundation of the Turkish Republic would preside over a dramatic shift from Islam to a form of radical secularism. It is widely acknowledged by sociologists that this did not penetrate Turkish society deep enough. Whilst early Republicans sought to redefine the boundaries of East and West, they had implicitly agreed to one of the most basic tenets of Orientalism, that the East was essentially different from the West, and that it was essentially stagnant and lacked the capacity to change without external stimulus. The contemporary design of Turkish mosques adhere rigidly to the principles and precepts established by the great 16th century architect, Ottoman architect Mimar Sinan, chief architect to the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He constantly sought new structural and spatial solutions for his designs. Yet what made Sinan great is the sought to relate the mosque to the context of the human in size and materiality. The Neo-Ottoman mosque as a typology seeks a return to the Ottoman Empire in its heyday, rather than as an evolutionary development of architectural language. They are often cheaply built and awkwardly proportioned mosques that neither strive for structural or spatial originality. Each composition is based upon a plethora of favorable design elements of one mosque, which is then combined with that of another. This is not perceived as exact replication, but rather the product of mimicry is therefore not interpreted as imitation, but as authenticity. The reinforced concrete structures imitating the forms of stone architecture of the 16th century silently confirm their inferiority in relation to the originals that they are imitating. Only a decade after the death of Ataturk, the founding father of the Turkish Republic, the Şişli Mosque was completed in Istanbul. It was the first ever mosque to be constructed in the Turkish Republic after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And unlike the architectural thought and production of the 1940s, which was shaped throughout the country by winds of modernism, this mosque reflected the classical Ottoman style. A prominent symbol of the contemporaneous Neo-Ottoman ambitions are often used as iconographical a bridge between preferred epochs, joining the misty palisades of some golden age to the hazy shores of some future promise. Therefore, the mosque becomes an unmistakable cultural marker on forward-thinking but Islamic-minded leadership. It is a fusion of Turkishness and Islam. Internally, it becomes a recognizable image abroad. It is within this uneasy relationship of Islam and nation in Turkey today that has led to the architectural mimicry of the Ottoman political context in the 21st century. The prevalence of such constructions, aside from being architecturally inferior, have only drawn further attention to the fact that the sheer numbers of these new mosques have far exceeded the actual need for prayer space. This underscores the symbolic importance of the building type in marking the newly acquired political power. Therefore, it is apparent that the mosque itself derived of its intended functionality to become a political agenda is in order to visualize the prevailing ideology of nationalism and religion within space. It seeks to remind the Turkish nation of their Islamic Ottoman history as a convergence of religious principles with political idiom. Thus, it also strives to make a wider impact on the context of urban society. Mosques now serve the ideals of a neoliberal Islamic elite. Aside from being a place of worship, the Çamlıca Republic Mosque will also accommodate an art gallery, museum, and shops. This distinctively postmodern juxtaposition of a consumer society with renewed religiosity can be viewed as an appropriate symbol of the culturally conservative and economically liberal turn that Turkey has taken. Today, the state-led mosque construction projects describe the physical combination of mobilized Islam and capitalism. It is within the radical denial of Islam that has resulted in an alienation and fragmentation of the self. I argue that it has resurfaced in a form of state-led initiative to reorientalize the self as a plausible, non-secularist, globally involved version of Turkey in both eyes of the West and the Islamic world. To the conservative Islamists who perceived that Turco-Islamic culture and symbolism had been under incessant attack in the Republican era, the Neo-Ottoman mosque serves as an ideological simulacrum disregarding the mismatch between Turkishness and Islam. I believe that it is not a meaningful evolution of architectural identity, but as an attempt to rebuild the glory of the past in today's conditions. So, as you can see from this slide, if we compare the bottom right, that is the Hagia Sophia. And then on the left is the Çamlıca Republic Mosque. So as you can see, the scale is beyond disproportionate in terms of the context of the human, and the minaret of the Sanjaklar Mosque, which I will explain a bit further. So yes, you can get a perspective of the Çamlıca Cami over Istanbul. The reconquering of Istanbul by Islamists has seen remarkable momentum from grassroots level amongst a newly emerged religious conservative professional middle class. Islamists who have often sought to make grandiose and iconic gains against the secular elite and have called for the building of spectacular mosques in symbolic locations such as Taksim Square. Building mosques in such locations enshrined in the secular state can be seen as a break from the secular vision of the Republic's founder. I believe that architecture in Turkey for mosques should take a more proactive and engaged stance in the design and not actually perpetuate this Neo-Ottoman typology. So when I arrived at the Sanjaklar Cami, it was situated in a seemingly unassuming location of a wealthy Istanbul suburb. I was greeted by a singular monolithic minaret. It identified its place and the stage for the call to prayer. Apart from this single decorative reference to Islam to denote its purpose, the mosque remains hidden both ideologically and physically. It was a deliberate decision for the building to be constructed without any recognizable markers of Islamic identity like a dome. This solitary minaret, an iconoclastic stela constructed from local stone, therefore detaches itself from the common historiographical indicators associated with the Islamic typology. The minaret becomes a supplementary sign of religious reference attached to the space of worship. The architect, Emre Aralat, has extrapolated the historical associations of the mosque and begins to replace them with the theological interpretations that refine Islamic ideals to their purest form. The architectural intention is to rebuke conceptions of Turkish cultural identity being based somehow on a tension between constructed notions of tradition and modernity. As I descended the stone steps into the sunken outer sanctum of the mosque, it became clear that the earthworks that enshroud the space formed a spiritual boundary, redefining the physical border between worlds. For me, it gave rise to a sense of interiority, a quality that differentiated it between religious architecture and the historical ideological assumptions of believers. In traditional Ottoman mosques, you usually enter the courtyard through a series of walled spaces where you then proceed to prepare with the ablutions for prayer. Whereas here, that delineation between the two spaces is merely, well, not merely, the landscape is used rather than a physical wall. In Turkey, historical presumptions of the mosque are intangible from architectural forms regarded as Islamic, such as a dome, which in turn is inextricable from the normative understanding of a religious place. In Turkey, mosques, tombs of sultans, and Islamic saints all usually comprise of a dome as a metaphysical connection between the boundaries of the material and immaterial afterlife. Unlike its Ottoman counterparts, which are zealously adorned with a cacophony of azure mosaics and calligraphy painted with gold, the Sanjaklar Mosque remains in a state of decorative silence. We are not distracted in prayer by the adoration of materiality, but rather reminded that the decision to relinquish the use of adornments and simply use textures from the material palette relates to the mosques that were built during the formative years of Islam, creating an architectural palette that eschews decoration in place of theology. Emre Aralat has worked faithfully to restore a sense of spirituality, not so much through overt references to religion, but through a site-specific architecture sensitive to locality, culture, crafts, and tradition. This was accomplished through an ideological reinterpretation of the mosque in regards to a religious place. Bereft of any historical presumptions, the viewer may look in favour of an architecture that narrates its own genius loci through the tactful use of materiality. He has achieved this vision in a society where a fixed and highly sanctified kind of mosque architecture prevails, and to disrepute or disregard has become synonymous with a denial of Islam. An innovative redeployment of Turkish materials to assemble a mosque that better suits the theological foundations of Islam, a representation of vernacular identity. The idea is that this mosque is not purely a concurrent rereading of ideology, but it is a rereading of ideology in religious space. It can be said that the architect started afresh on the basis of functional requirements of prayer and a contemporary interpretation of an urban landmark. What the architectural composition of the Sanjaklar has actually managed to fulfill is a mosque that tacitly implies a poetic religiosity that tactfully steers the mosque away from the proactive realms of politics, nationhood, and revives a new context of ethics and aesthetics. So, as you can see in this mosque, it is pretty unadorned. It is what I described earlier as decorative silence. The only thing that is in this mosque in terms of decoration is the word of God on the far screen. Now, what you can't see in the images that I've taken is the fact that, unlike the Ottoman mosques, women pray side by side with men. They don't pray behind men, but they pray alongside men, separated by a screen. And actually, a recurring theme throughout my research was that the role of women in regards to the mosque in contemporary society is that most of the women who I spoke to felt rather uneasy that they were still made to pray behind men. This meant that they mostly never wanted to attend a mosque at all. For me, it highlighted a very societal issue, a patriarchal narrative where women's insecurity could be traced back to earlier periods in Islamic and Ottoman history. These were being perpetuated in the present day purely in part by the continuation of the Neo-Ottoman mosque as a typology. During the radical secularization of the Kemalist period, part of the modernization process was the emancipation of women from Islam. Turkish women were granted certain rights atypical for an Islamic country. They were to become Western and therefore modern, derived of the veil and its Ottoman Islamic connotations. So that's my final image, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was so good. If anyone has any questions, please pitch them in the chat. It now should be open publicly. But I think maybe it would be nice if, I guess, you two kind of have a kind of conversation about how your two pieces of research intersect, and like how, and kind of how they, I guess, how they came about.
Matthew, would you like to start?
Yes, so Krzysztof was my tutor during MArch at Sheffield for my dissertation, and I got to read quite a bit of his work, and as I was writing, I was really inspired by how Krzysztof writes, and there was this idea that I haven't really touched upon, but that you are in and within a space. And for me, that resonated because I was writing about identity and the fact that the idea of being in and within a space is completely dependent on several constructs that you begin to put on yourself. Either they're given to you by your parents in the form of names, or what you associate with as an ethnic association. You feel, I'd never say I was fully Turkish, and I'm never fully British. I'm a weird mix of the two. So yeah, it's it was when I got given this opportunity to speak for with the Architecture Foundation, I knew that the only person I'd want to do a discussion with is Krzysztof, because we have I owe to him a lot of my founding research interests in politics and secularity. Quite interestingly enough, what I observed from this talk is the fact that I don't know how it is in Brazil, but you mentioned the need for not necessarily having spaces to pray in. And for me, in my research, it was more the fact that the Ottoman typologies were preventing women from feeling as equal citizens in a modern secular republic. So I don't know how that perhaps links with what you found in Brazil.
I think I think that there's two very strong links between what Matthew was talking about and what I was talking about and what I was observing in Brazil. And of course, as I said, there was in audience there was a Carolina who was member of our research team. So if I'm going to say something wrong, please correct me, because I'm not Brazilian. I'm outsider doing this research. And also, it's slightly, I feel a little bit, uncomfortable talking about this, because the talk is done by two men, two white men, even worse. But yes, the position of women and women in a context of kind of religious landscape in Turkey and Brazil, there was definitely similarities. Brazilian society is also, pretty strong with the patriarchal. And people that we interviewed, most of them, I can't tell from the top of my head, but I would say about 80% probably. So 80% of our interviews, with women, and they were speaking very strongly about the religion, and this tension between religion as kind of politicized way of representing the kind of or building or creating social bonds. That's very strong in what Matthew was talking about. And in many cases, even from this quote that I show you, there's almost kind of this spice of this kind of religion which is kind of presented. So all people that we have been talking with, they were strong believers, and their life were organized by their faith. But they in the same moment they were extremely critical about pastors and about the more kind of institutional religion. So I think that this is one link. Definitely the position of women in Brazil, in Turkey, in general, patriarchal society, and religion, which is kind of making this reproduce this social role. The other, I think, link is which is very interesting to me, and it's a probably slight disagreement here. Maybe there's an interesting opening to discussion because there's nothing really we disagreeing. But the last mosque that Matthew you are showing, and you were using word spirituality, and you have been talking about spirituality. And when I was working in Brazil, I was thinking very strongly if what I'm observing, this very personal way of practicing faith, is it also, could it be called spirituality? And I decided not to. I think that it would be misleading. That it's and this kind of distinction between spirituality and faith, it's probably very difficult, but I kind of feel that this is something important, that the spirituality is more kind of personal, and I observe really influence the behavior and the life of people. So if I can ask, who is attending the mosque that you show, and how you understand, and how these people, it's not about you really, but about the people who are going there, how you think they understand faith and spirituality?
So the Sanjaklar Mosque is, as I mentioned, set in quite a wealthy Istanbul suburb. And Emre Aralat is quite a well-known architect. And I think, yes, there are lots of encoded secular moves within this mosque, but the idea of how women and men should behave, not necessarily based on their spirituality, is very, it's almost culturally ingrained. I mean, one of the things I didn't show was the fact that the imam had gone along and put up his own wooden screen alongside the separated space for men and women, so that you know, that he thought that what the architect has done was too low. In terms of spirituality, I'm not quite sure yet. I think that's something I want to look at after this discussion in further depth, ongoing with my research, in terms of what actually spirituality is in Turkey. Because you often find with lots of spaces that you have lots of mosques were turned into, lots of churches were turned into mosques. And now, again, there are some small Greek churches in Turkey that are mosques. But because a mosque is not a, what's the word, a sanctified space as such, in terms of how perhaps Catholic churches are, there is less of a need to actually go to them to fulfill your spiritual desires, shall we say. It's more that actually going to the mosque is a cultural norm, and the spirituality is totally dependent on the person. I'm not really sure that answers your question.
I'm going to
Yes,
jump in quickly as we've got a question from someone in the audience, from Ian Page. Ian, I'm going to unmute you quickly if you'd like to directly ask the question.
Sure. Hi, thanks both for two very interesting presentations. I'm not sure this is what's sort of the aim of your research. I was quite interested in the about the sort of political influence on these religious structures. And Krzysztof, you seem to suggest that the need for the space to pray had diminished, and religion is becoming sort of more individualized. But the megastructures of these sort of evangelical churches in Brazil suggest that the donations from the congregations are quite healthy, unless there's another aspect of the funding I don't understand. And similarly, Matthew, I think you suggested that the Ottoman-style mosques are directly funded by the government in order to create a sort of political landscape. I just wondered if you could maybe expand a little bit.
I can start. Not necessarily. I think that this is not what I really wanted to say, that this the need for spaces is diminishing. I was rather trying to paint the relatively diverse and pluralistic picture of religious landscape in Brazil, because it's very often it's presented only in a very simplistic way, that there are only these mega churches and they are only very right wing and they are only supporting President Bolsonaro. But I was trying to say that, of course, they are majority, but there are also other aspects of a different way of practicing religion. And of course, there are also other aspects of funding this massive churches. So in general, these churches are businesses. Yeah, they have very strong political influences, and they are looking for influences. And also, especially Universal Church, they preach something that is called prosperity gospel. In prosperity gospel, it's a kind of business relationship. Yeah? So the believer is giving money to the church in expectation that God will give more money back. So this relationship, this mechanism, of course, makes this particular church extremely powerful, extremely rich. Other churches, other also Pentecostal churches, they refuse. Not all of them. Yeah. So there's really a lot of very different strands, but there are churches that, especially the small churches, they are rejecting prosperity gospel. They are not expecting people to give them money in that way. So of course they are much more poor. They don't have this kind of influence and this kind of money. So that what I'm not really trying to make any kind of definite statement. I was rather trying to show that it's not so obvious and so straightforward as it's presented by media.
Yeah, I find it quite encouraging actually that the smaller churches exist, because I mean those megastructures. My wife's from Brazil, and there's a similar structure in Curitiba, and they just dominate the landscape so incredibly, like the visual landscape. So I guess it's quite encouraging that I guess it's more of a ground up sort of movement of the smaller churches. It's quite interesting. Thanks.
Matthew?
Yes, so the question on funding of the mosques. So with the Sanjaklar Mosque, it was primarily funded by the local community who live in this wealthy middle-class Istanbul suburb. Whereas such mega projects as the Çamlıca and what I showed earlier, some of the smaller mosques that you find around Turkey, they've all been funded by the government indirectly through the Diyanet, which is the Religious Affairs Authority. They often are the ones that commission these projects. In terms of my research, it was more that the more I spoke to people, the more I found out that actually the mosques are not necessarily just there for a religious purpose. In fact, lots of them now have shops and supermarkets, to a whole range of buildings in there. So there's an element of that that these constructions need to provide for a wider community. But the fact that purely by chance that these Ottoman mosques were continuing that age-old practice of women praying behind men, it's more in line with the government party line in terms of replicating a glorious Ottoman past, in terms of the where the funding comes from. I think that's their choice to go with that narrative. And I know for the Sanjaklar Mosque, President Erdogan himself stepped in at the last moment to discuss a few tweaks to the project to make it look a bit more Ottoman.
It's quite interesting in the context of some of the other conversations that have been going on around this 100-day studio about the political influence of architecture, or how much influence architects can actually have. And I mean, this is definitely an example of architecture having an influence on the visual political landscape. You seem to hope essentially that the smaller mosque that you showed at the end of your talk would influence the architecture of others. Do you see it? Do you see I mean, you can obviously see the struggle of how difficult it is for architects themselves to influence politics.
Yeah.
But do you see a chance for that within the architecture of this mosque?
No, I don't think so. I think it's because even the Sanjaklar Mosque, it had its review processes with the various imams and the people that funded the mosque. So I think had I gone into more depth about that, we would see that this isn't a vision of secularity that we perhaps think it is in this lecture. Yeah. I think it could be really dug into in the whole lecture itself. But I'm hopeful that the architectural narrative changes, because I'm hopeful that it changes, but I also don't think it will. Okay. Quietly pessimistic.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Do you think you could both touch on a little bit more about the kind of impact of COVID-19 and kind of how what you were talking about, Krzysztof, with the president of Brazil kind of completely rejecting like social distancing within churches and like keeping them open, and like if that's Turkey hasn't been impacted hugely by COVID, I don't think, but like how it's what do you think about that?
I wanted to include the COVID-19 partly because it just stopped me to go to Brazil, but also because it makes very clear this tension between different strands in Brazilian evangelical movement. And I think it's also related to the way how, especially for Pentecostal churches, how the religion is practiced. which is very communal with singing and dancing. So being at least in part of them, not all churches. Some of them are extremely kind of strict in not doing anything like that. But in general, I think that this is interesting that the smaller churches, especially not Pentecostal, the kind of traditional part of Protestant movement, they at that situation they make a stand, and then the big churches, the mega churches that are supporting President Bolsonaro, they also had opportunity to make a stand. So I think it's a very good example of the connection between politics and religion that COVID just allowed this to happen. Matthew?
So I deliberately avoided any reference to COVID-19. And I decided to do a talk on the mosques totally regardless of the situation that is happening outside these walls. I think that's perhaps more my worldview, being a bit focused on my own interests, perhaps. But yes, I haven't looked. I don't know